Well, over the last several times that I've spoken, we've been talking about what to do when you don't know what to do. And we've spent the first 3 lessons in this series talking about Proverbs 3 verses 5 and 6 and kind of breaking that out into something that we can use very practically when we reach these points in time in our life where we feel like we don't know what to do. And so I'd invite you to turn to Proverbs 3 and maybe hold your place there in James 1. We're going to come back to that text for our lesson today, but I want to remind us of Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 and this basic structure that we're looking at. And what we're going to begin to do today is to look at specific things we face and how we can put this into practice and understand it as we look at different things that the Scriptures teach us about ourselves and the temptations and trials that we encounter. Proverbs 3 verse 5 and 6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct your paths." And so as we've looked at this, we've talked about kind of 3 points that we can see very clearly in this that are practical for us to use. One is to trust God. He says that right from the very beginning in verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Second is don't trust yourself. Lean not on your own understanding is the second part of verse 5 there in Proverbs 3. And third is to always choose God's way. And much of what we're going to be looking at over the next several weeks has to do with this always choose God's way. And sometimes we have to back up and put it in perspective of those first 2 in order to actually make that decision to always choose God's way. Verse 6 of Proverbs 3 is that decision point. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct our paths. And so as we've looked at that, we've examined that a little bit closer each time. Number 1, that trusting God. We've got to turn to God, tell God, trust God completely. And we see that in a number of examples throughout the Scriptures. When we think about not trusting ourselves, we're warned about this throughout the Scriptures, not to trust ourselves. That we've got to understand our own limitations. We've got to understand when our selfish ambitions are getting in the way, when we're thinking about our own personal accomplishments and experience, that all those things have very real limitations. And ultimately, we've got to go back to looking at God and what He would have us to do. And so last time we talked about always choosing God's way, and that we've got to choose to serve God. We've got to live by every word of God. We've got to understand when we're looking at God's Word that it is the ultimate authority for our lives. It's not going to be what we think or what anybody else thinks. It's ultimately going to be what God thinks. And He's got to say it, we got to hear it, and that's got to settle it. That's got to be the end of it when we're thinking about always choosing God's way. So this morning, I want us to talk about what to do when you face temptation. Now, temptation is also kind of one of these gateway deals, because temptation in and of itself is a heading above any number of other things that we're going to face. And so in dealing with this gateway of temptation, hopefully this will help us as we encounter many things. And I want to, as we go forward, deal with some more specific things, but in the beginning, let's deal with something like this that's a gateway. Temptation, okay? And we all face temptations. This is a reality. And in facing temptations, a lot of it is stepping back and understanding what's happening that will help us actually overcome the temptations that we're facing. And following this process, if you will, in Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 is ultimately the way that we need to face temptation. And I want to look at 3 things this morning that again can kind of become a checklist, if you will, when you realize, and I realize, that we're in a moment of temptation. And I dare say, and hopefully tonight we can kind of discuss this more openly, that when we look back at when we have failed, when we face temptation, that at least one of these 3 things went undone completely. And in all likelihood, some part of all 3 went undone completely. And so when we look back, now we can kind of say, boy, was I stupid. And boy, was that just wrong. Because it's easy to see when I look back. So what I'm challenging us to think about today is, how do we realize it when we're in the moment? And how do we stop long enough in the moment to at least do these three things before we make a decision, before we say something, do something, think too long on something, or any of the above? Well, the first thing that I want us to think about should be obvious, but it may be the least done. And that's to pray. When you face temptations, can you honestly say that the first thing you do is stop to pray? I'll admit that's hard for me. That's hard for me. And so I would figure it's probably hard for you. Do you remember in Luke 22 when Jesus is in the garden and it's getting down to His last hours, and the disciples, you can kind of tell as you read between the lines and all this, that they're confused and they're struggling and they don't quite understand what's going on. And so in view of that, we could kind of take the disciples of Jesus and we could actually kind of put them in this category that we're talking about. What to do when you don't know what to do. You could do a study on the apostles themselves in these last few weeks of Jesus' life in regard to what to do when you don't know what to do, because they obviously were in that situation. Peter especially, several times he speaks out and says things that as we look back at it, it doesn't make any sense, but what it really has to do with is he was in a place where he didn't know what to do. And as they approach one of these moments in Luke 22, in the garden, in the Mount of Olives, Jesus says something to those disciples that I believe He could say to me and you every time we face temptation or are about to face temptation. Look at Luke 22, verse 40. When He, that is Jesus, came to the place, He said to them, that is to these apostles, disciples, these close disciples of His, pray that you may not enter into temptation. Pray. You know, this moment where temptation could be what they face is coming. Could I just have us think for a minute about the reality that we know, if we stop and think about it, we know certain times that a time of temptation is coming. We know it. We wake up on a Monday morning and we're already not feeling great or not thrilled about going to work or going to school or whatever it is. And we should know at the very onset of that day that when I encounter people, there will be certain temptations. And when I encounter the upcoming decisions of the day, there will be certain temptations. Our young people, when they go to school or when they go to a certain get-together or gathering of friends, when they're with friends, when they're at this when you go home, there are certain temptations that can creep in those secret places. We know when we enter certain places, times, activities, atmospheres, we know we're about to enter a place of potential temptation. So what should we do? Shouldn't we follow the recipe laid out by our Lord right here? Pray that you may not enter temptation. In other words, recognize it before you ever get there. Are there some things in life that we need to make a pre-decision about? Yeah. In other words, I'm going to decide to bridle my tongue before I'm in the presence of those people that provoke me. I know they provoke me. I know they stir something up inside of me. I know that I end up wanting to say something when I need to hold my... So I'm going to pray, and I'm going to predetermine and pre-decide that before I'm in their presence, I will have the strength to bridle my tongue. Our young people, when they're going on dates, are there some lines that need to be drawn? before ever going on the date. You don't want to decide in the moment. So we need to teach, and we need to consult, and we need to talk with young people in the dating world, that here are lines that need to be drawn. There are decisions to be made before you're in the place of decision. And may I suggest they need to be prayerfully made. Prayerfully made. The things that are going to happen within the atmosphere of your home, the language that will be used, the things that will be viewed on a television or on the computer, the music that will be listened to, many of those things are things that need to be pre-decisions. In other words, we're not going to just channel surf. We're going to already know there are certain things we will not watch. And we're not just going to music surf. We know there are certain things we are not going to listen to. And so I'm making the pre-decision. And those things can help eliminate many temptations. Pray. Pray for that wisdom. Pray for that strength. Pray so that you stop long enough to think it through. You know, to me, that's one of the great benefits of prayer. I find this every time I really stop to pray. When I really stop to pray, regardless of whether or not God answers that prayer in some way that I think He should answer it, one of the great benefits of me stopping to pray is I just stopped long enough to think it through. And by that alone, God can give me wisdom to make the right decision. Boy, there's a lot of power in that. When you face temptation, when you know you're about to go into an atmosphere where there may be temptation, I urge you and I to pray. Along with this, think about 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13. In 1 Corinthians 10, Paul has reminded the church at Corinth about Old Testament examples. He's reminded them about Moses and the children of Israel and the things that had taken place with those people, and how that some were killed and punished because of their sins, because of the things they did wrong. And he says in verse 9, nor let us tempt Christ. In other words, we don't need to be the ones provoking God the way that those in the Old Testament times did. In verse 10 he says, nor complain, as some of them were destroyed, as some of them also complained and were destroyed. And then he says in verse 11, all these things happened to them as examples. You know, we should be learning from these things. And then there's a warning in verse 12 that goes along with our don't trust yourselves, don't trust myself. Verse 12, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. But with that warning about not trusting ourselves, there's an admonition, a teaching, a principle to be learned in verse 13. And that's what I want us to spend a few moments on in thinking about what to do when we face temptations from a pre-decision standpoint. He says, no temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. Now, breaking this verse down, there is a lot to learn from it. Let's just take it phrase by phrase. Number one, he says, no temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. So when you're about to face an atmosphere of temptation, and when you realize I'm being tempted, you know what one of the first things you need to remember is? It's not new to you. It's not new to you. You're not alone. You know, one of the worst things that we feel in this life is when we feel like we're alone. This verse is there reminding us we're not alone. The things that you're tempted with, someone else is tempted with. Are we all tempted exactly the same? No. But we're not tempted differently either. So something may have a greater pull on you than it does me, but there's somebody else probably right within your own circle that has that great pull on them too, just like you. And the thing that has the great pull on me that doesn't have the great pull on you, there's somebody that has that great pull of temptation there too. In other words, again, we're not alone. We're not alone. So if you ever catch yourself saying, well, nobody else has to deal with this. Nobody else has ever faced this. Nobody knows what I'm feeling. Nobody knows what I'm going through. Nobody... You get my point here? God's telling us in this verse, don't say that. Don't say that. Because temptations are common. They're common to all of mankind. Secondly, he says, God is faithful. Well, this goes back to Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. The very first point of that is, trust in the Lord with all of your heart. One of the temptations that we face when we face temptation is to blame God. Isn't it? And ask why. Why would God let this happen? Why would God allow evil to be in this world? Why? And when we do that, we're doubting God and we're not trusting God, and we're given a place for a lot of things that don't need to have a place. And so I need to remember, God is faithful. God is faithful. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Look at the next phrase. God is faithful, and God will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able. Have you ever been in one of these situations where you're kind of at the end of your rope, you feel like, and so you say, I can't do this? You ever said that? I can't handle this. You know what God would nudge us and say? Yes, you can. Yes, you can. That's a great comfort to have when we face these atmospheres of temptation, is to know that God has already promised that He's not going to allow the temptation to be greater than what we're able to bear. You've got this. Or you can have this. It's not impossible. It's not impossible. There's two parts of the last phrase that I want to emphasize. And they go along with what we just said. So God's not going to allow us to be tempted beyond what we're able to bear. But then he says, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape. All right, keep that thought in mind, the way of escape. And then he says, that you may be able to bear it. Let's talk about the way of escape for a moment. You know, part of the praying before we enter the place of temptation should be, Lord, help me see the way of escape. Lord, help me see the doorway out. I mean, if the whole place was on fire and it's all burning to a crisp and we got to get out, then we need to know where the doors are. We need to know where the windows are. We need to know every way out. Right? And it's the same with temptation. And so I need to be praying that constantly. Constantly praying that God will show me the way out. The way to get away from this temptation. To escape it. The second part of that phrase is that you may be able to bear it. Now, He's already promised not to tempt us beyond what we're able. But just because God shows us the doorway out, does that mean that something's going to magically pick us up and usher us out of that door? Oh, there's my part's in there, isn't it? My part's in there. I could lay a $100 bill up here on this table and say, this is free. But you got to come get it. And if you just sit there, who's that on? That's on you. Sometimes I kind of unlovingly say, well, that's a them problem. You ever say that? That's a you problem. If I lay a $100 bill here and say it's free, and you just sit there, that's a you problem. If I pray and God shows me the way out, and I still choose to do something I shouldn't do, that's a me problem. Recognizing that I'm able to bear it, that I'm able to walk out that door, that I'm able to say no, that I'm able to draw the line, that I'm able to avoid this, that I'm able to stop this. Recognizing it is one thing, doing it is another. They say that it takes like 21 times of doing something for it to become a habit. Let's reverse psychology that for a minute. You realize that it may take me and you praying 21 times and choosing 21 times to overcome a single temptation? Reverse psychology it. It might take me laying a $100 bill up here 21 times for somebody to actually be willing to get up, walk down the aisle, and take it. We're hard-headed. So don't stop after time number 10 or 15 or 20. And for some of you who are thicker-skulled like I am, don't stop after 21, because that might be the average. It might take me and you 40 times to get it right. But remember this verse. God has said that their way of escape is there, and you're able to bear it. We got to pick up and choose to do it. So when we face temptations, or we face a potential atmosphere of temptation, begin by praying. And when thinking about that praying, doesn't it go along with Proverbs 3, 5, and 6? Because when I pray, I'm turning to God. And I'm telling God. Because I trust God. And I'm striving to acknowledge Him and not myself. Sometimes we have conversations with ourselves instead of praying to God. Second thing I want us to consider this morning is that when we face temptations, we need to focus. We need to focus. We have a hard time with this. And a lot of times this is what ends up being our downfall, is we lack the ability to focus long enough to deal with it the way that it needs to be dealt with. In 1 Peter 4, just to give you an example of this mentality, in 1 Peter 4 and verse 12, Peter writes, "Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you." Now I want you to picture this mentality. So he's saying, don't think this is strange. Don't be surprised by this. In verse 13 he says, "But rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when His glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy." He goes on and talks about these things. But I want you to, in verse 12, he's giving a warning because we tend to be surprised by things. Okay? Now, the extreme opposite of being surprised is to be focused and in tune to where it doesn't surprise you. That's the opposite. To be expecting it. Coaching baseball for many years, one of the most basic things that there's no telling how many times a coach will say it is keep your eye on the ball. You think that that's a no-brainer, wouldn't you? I mean, it's baseball. The dude's hurling it at me at a high speed. I got to watch it. I'm out in the field with a glove on my hand. I got to pay attention. It could be hit to me at any time. And so one of the great accomplishments of any good baseball player is simply to be focused. Focused on that ball. And to not think it's strange when the guy throws a curveball. And to not think it's strange when the ball's hit to me at shortstop. You ever seen a kid playing ball and the ball's hit to them and they're like, "Oh, what's happening?" It's like, hey, that's part of it. That's what's supposed to happen. Or the kid who hits the ball and stands there like, "Oh, what just happened?" Now you're supposed to run. And I say those things to get us to picture what I'm saying about this is what happens in Christian life too. When we're not focused, man, we can look really silly. Because the devil is, as Ephesians 6 says, he's putting fiery darts out there. He's hurling stuff at us. And we shouldn't think it's strange. We should be focused. When we face temptations, there might be a time in which we've said, "Well, I didn't see that coming." Well, why not? Or there might be a time when we say, "Well, I didn't know." Well, why not? Or it just got out of hand before I realized it. In 1 Peter 5, as you read through Peter, Peter's a good example of somebody who needs to be focused, right? I mean, go back and you examine what happened with him as he followed Jesus while Jesus was on the earth. He seemed to be the one that was walking right behind Jesus. So when Jesus stopped, Peter probably ran into him. He just followed him that close. And he was all up in his business, and he was front and center, and he wanted to answer as soon as he could answer for everything. And so in a sense, he had this laser focus. But sometimes when you have that kind of laser focus, you're also oblivious to all this other stuff. And it's like Peter couldn't see everything. Well, when you read 1 and 2 Peter, it's like Peter's light bulb has gone off. And he sees it all. And so he's telling us, hey, don't think it's strange. There was a time I once thought it was strange that Jesus was going to suffer and die at the hands of these sinners. But not anymore. Matter of fact, Peter, I think with all the apostles, came to understand we're all going to suffer. Matter of fact, if you look there in chapter 4 and verse 16, he says, "Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter." He knew it was going to happen. So in chapter 5 and verse 8, we shouldn't be shocked to hear Peter say, "Be sober, be vigilant, focus," right? "Because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour." You got to always be ready. Temptation's coming. Remember what Jesus even said to Peter at one point in time? He said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." And can you imagine Peter being like, "Where's Satan at?" But as he's writing 1 Peter 5, he's got this laser focus, and he's saying, "I see him coming in the weeds over there like a lion, stalking his prey." And you and I need to see that. We need to be like the one who can see him in the weeds before he's coming, a long way off. And we're ready. We're focused. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. Don't trust your next step. You need to be focused, looking ahead at what the devil might bring to you. In all your ways acknowledge God. Let Him direct our paths. He can direct us away from the lion, away from that fiery trial, as much as it can be avoided. Third, this morning, when you face temptations, you need to understand what's happening. Okay? You need to understand what's happening. Obviously, prayer is a big part of this. Focus is a big part of this. But there needs to be an understanding of what's happening. Look at James chapter 1. This is where our reading came from this morning. James 1, beginning in verse 12, it says, "Blessed is the man who endures temptation. For when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love Him." So he starts with this promise, this good picture here. That the man who endures, who survives, who makes it through this time of temptation, that man will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised. Now he teaches about it. Verse 13. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. All right, now this goes back to what we were talking about even in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. God is faithful. So I don't need to blame God. Don't say that it's God's fault. Okay, I don't need to do that. Let's cast the blame where it belongs. Whose fault is it when we're tempted? It's the devil and it's ourselves. Let's just cast the blame right where it belongs. Go back to the Garden of Eden when all this started. Who showed up? The devil did. He showed up and he presented the temptation. And then it was, the ball was in the court of Eve and Adam to make the decision at that point in time. God didn't do it. God wasn't to blame. And He's not to blame when we face temptations either. So understand what's happening. Because when I hear somebody blaming God, or when I'm tempted to blame God, ultimately we just don't get it. We just don't get it. And so we need to back up, reset our perspective, and understand what's happening. Verse 13 again, let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does He Himself tempt anyone. It is not God that we're dealing with when we're facing temptation. Verse 14, but each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. So again, who is to blame? Well, the devil, obviously, who seeks to devour us like a roaring lion, who has his fiery darts and his temptations and different things. He's the producer of all of that. But who's it targeted at? Me. Each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. I want you to think back to Eve and the serpent in the Garden of Eden. And the serpent comes to Eve, and Eve is in this place in the Garden of Eden where has everything and been told that you can't have one thing. And the devil comes in and he forms the temptation in such a way that now Eve is forgetting about everything and looking at the one thing. That's what this verse says. Each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. And when that happens, have we trusted in the Lord with all of our heart? No. Are we leaning on our own understanding? Yep. Are we in all of our ways acknowledging Him? Nope. He says in verse 15, then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. And then he says in verse 16, do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Don't be fooled by temptation. See it for what it is. Understand what's happening. As you go on and read through the rest of that chapter, he gives some insights into a lot of those things. That every good gift comes from God. Again, don't blame God. What God gives is good. And so we need to be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. In other words, we need to stop and pray. We need to focus. We need to see what's happening. And we need to make the right choice. Be doers of the word and not hearers only. In 2 Peter 2, going back to some of Peter's writing, as he's warning about false teachers and the ultimate doom of these false teachers, he makes a statement in the midst of this that I find extremely encouraging when thinking about what to do when I face temptations. I want to read some of the context to you, though. In 2 Peter 2, beginning in verse 4, he says, for if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into the chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterward would live ungodly, and delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. For that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. Notice what he says. So all this, God punished the unrighteous. And we've seen that through all these examples. Now notice what he says. He says, if all that, we know all that's the case, and Noah was spared, right? And Lot was spared. Then, verse 9, then the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations and to reserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment. We sing a song sometimes, I don't believe it's in the book we're currently using, "The Lord will make a way for me." And in that song, it's a very strong statement. I know the Lord will make a way for me. Do you know that? Because when I come to the place that I face temptation, that's what, above all else, I need to know that. I need to know that the Lord will make a way. And if I'm having a hard time seeing it, and I probably will, then I need to stop and I need to pray. If I'm having a hard time seeing it, then I need to stop and I need to reset my focus. Get my eye on the ball. I need to be looking for the lion in the weeds. And if I'm still struggling after the 3rd time and the 4th time and the 10th time and the 15th time, and I'm still falling to the same temptation, maybe I need to step back and I need to understand what's happening. I need to understand what's happening. I need to blame who needs to be blamed. That the devil is presenting me with something that takes me away from everything that God has promised. And I need to own up that I am choosing the wrong thing. It'll help that a lot if I make pre-decisions. That I'm not going to do this, not going to say this, not going to go there. But we're all going to face it in multiple places, in multiple ways. And we've got to trust and we've got to obey and look for that way of escape. What to do when you don't know what to do? It's simple, and at the same time, it's very difficult because of our humanity and our struggle. This morning, if you're kind of in that place where you're feeling like you need to do something, let me encourage you to do it. If you need to make something right between you and someone else, make it right. If you need to make things right between you and God, make it right. If you've never become a Christian, I hope you're feeling a tug inside of you to understand that you don't have it within yourself to save yourself. That's going to be a God thing. And so you need to give obedience to Him. Jesus said, "He that believes and is baptized shall be saved." You need to put your hope and trust in that, not in yourself. Because how are you going to save yourself? So if you haven't become a Christian, then you need to do that today. Because right now the temptation that's facing you is ultimately the temptation to tell God no. Don't give in to that any longer. You may have heard 1,000 sermons, so you may be, really breaking the curve out here and have said no to God 1,000 times. But you know what? Those 1,000 times really don't matter if you'll say yes to God today and give obedience to Him. Whatever your need may be, we just want to help. And would hope that you would have the courage to come while we stand and sing.